Most every framework takes the URL and form scopes and combines them into one new place. Coldbox does the same thing, and that place is called the request context, or RC for short. It sounds a lot fancier than it is. Really, the main takeaway here is in a Coldbox app, instead of saying form.username or url.username to get to your data, you'd write code saying something like rc.username instead. Coldbox will figure out if that username variable used to be in the URL or the form scope behind the scenes for you automatically. So why do we do it this way? Well, have you ever worked on a legacy app and seen code that said if form.user is defined and not url.user, or vice versa, or variations of that where you're looking for a thing that might be in the URL scope or might be in the form scope? Often people got into those annoying situations in their legacy apps where they had to check, did this variable come in from the URL or from the form, or maybe it came from somewhere else? And you had these big annoying if-else statements everywhere cluttering up your code base. With the RC scope, those go away. You never have to do that again. It's just rc.variablename, boom, you're done. Use the same syntax for the PRC, or private request collection, prc.variablename. So prc.username, prc.age, whatever the thing is that you're looking for. The only difference in RC and PRC is what kind of data you put in them. The recommended practice is you use RC for things that come from the user, URL and form variables basically, things that the browser would hand over into your application, stuff like that. PRC is the private collection. Use that for everything else. For example, if you've got data coming out of a database or from an API call, you put those in the PRC scope. That way we can quickly tell which data came from a user and might need additional sanitizing before it can be safely used, and which data came from just somewhere else internally in our app. And that data you can probably consider safe, and you can have less extra code doing the sanitizing, the general assumption being it was sanitized on the way into the system earlier by some other process. Maybe that depends on the kind of application you're dealing with, whether you do have to do extra sanitizing or not to your PRC scope, but the general takeaway here is you want to always make sure that you do sanitize data coming in from your user. Anything coming in from a form scope or a URL could have SQL injection attacks attached to it, could have other sort of malicious data hooked in. Just generally don't ever consider data coming from your user safe and clean until you've written code that makes sure it's safe and clean. So that's why we visually separate everything. We put all of that user data in our RC scope, and we put everything else in the PRC scope. Okay, so now let's take a look at the RC scope in action in a basic spot in our web app so you can see how that actually works. Here I've got the users.details event page in our app, and right now it's just drawing the header user details on the screen for us. We can take a look at our users handler. You can see my details method is completely empty right now. Nothing happens there, though just like all the other handlers, we're passing the event RC and PRC scopes into that handler. That's just a convention that always happens with your handlers in Coldbox. And here's my matching details view. There's the header being drawn on the screen that we saw a minute ago. And I have this if statement here saying if we got a variable rc.person defined, then it will draw a greeting saying hello and whatever the person's name is. Right now that's completely empty, so we get nothing on the screen. Now let's go back here to our handler, and I'm going to go ahead and add rc.person. We'll set that equal to null. Save, go back to our browser and reload, and you can see now I get the hello Nolan greeting on the screen because our if statement is now true, rc.person is defined, and there we go. Now let's go back here to our handler, and I'm going to comment out that line so it doesn't actually work. Refresh the browser once more. Now we're back to this first version of the page that we saw where the hello person name does not exist. At the beginning of this video, we mentioned how the RC scope is a combination of your form post and your URL variables that get combined into one spot and used in your application the Coldbox way. What that means is I can go up here to my URL and say add person equals, and I'll put the name David up here this time. And notice how that's a URL variable, but it appeared on the screen coming out of the RC scope. So behind the scenes, Coldbox did combine our URL and form variables and put them into one spot, RC dot, in this case, person. And I can pass in URL variables and have those go into the RC scope. I could, if I had a form post here, I could have a form field, of course, and it would work the same way. And I can also just hard code in data rc.person. Now we're going to have both rc.person defined here in the handler, and I've got basically rc.person defined here in the URL. The one in the URL is set to David. The one in the handler itself is set to Nolan. If I shift reload this page, you can see that the one hard-coded in my handler is overriding the one in the URL. However, if I don't have that code here in my handler, then that URL variable coming in will actually be the one that gets used. So you have a couple of different ways you can set your RC scope variables, URL, form, or just hard code them somewhere in your handler, and those will all work. That's basically the idea. There's not a whole lot more you can do with an RC scope. It's just instead of saying form.username or URL.username, you'd say rc.username, or in this case, rc.person, and there you go. You'll use this throughout all of your Coldbox applications. You really won't find a whole lot of spots in your Coldbox apps where you're writing URL dot some variable name or form dot some variable name. That'll all be turned into rc dot or prc dot for your Coldbox applications. Actually, I take it back. It's going to be just rc dot because this is all stuff coming from the user. You won't put that in the PRC scope at all. So here's the handler we looked at just a minute ago. And as you saw, we can have rc dot variables used within the handler to set them to different pieces of data. I can also use the RC scope in the view and set data that way, or rather use data that way. You could technically set it as well, but you generally don't do a whole lot of business logic type stuff in your view layer. You try to keep that just to mostly displaying the data outright if you can. But the takeaway here is you can use the RC scopes in your view, and you can use the RC scopes in your handlers. So what other places in Coldbox can you use RC scopes? Here's a diagram from the books online at coldbox.ortusbooks.com. And you can see we already talked about it. You can use it in your views and you can use it in your handlers. You can also use both RC and PRC scopes in your layouts. Remember, that's the wrapper HTML stuff that goes basically around your page, your site header and footer, your main navigation, things of that nature. Back here in our view, this highlighted part here is what's in our view file. So this charcoal bar across the top with our about navigation and our footer, those are all coming out of your layout. You can use RC and PRC scope in your layouts if you want to, as well as the handlers and views like we just mentioned. And you can also use them in your interceptors. We haven't talked about interceptors yet. They're a little bit more of a fancy feature. We'll get into those in a later video, but for now you can just use this diagram as a point of reference for the 4 main places in your Coldbox apps where you can use both the RC and PRC scopes, and that'll work for any Coldbox app you build, no matter what you're doing with it. Okay, so we've talked about the RC scope and PRC scope. We know that those are just places to hold your data as they get passed around between the different sections of your Coldbox application: layouts, handlers, views, and interceptors. Here we've got an RC scoped piece of data in our handler, and I'm going to put a piece of data in the PRC scope just to say we did, and then we can compare both scopes and see if there's anything different between the two of them. Favorite PRC dot favorite color is green. We're not actually using the PRC scope anywhere here in our view, so let's just go ahead and add a couple of dump statements here in our handler to take a look at this data. Write dump RC and write dump PRC. Load that up. Here's our RC scope. Here's our PRC scope. You can see RC has that rc.person variable that we set earlier in our handler. It's also got the event URL variable coming in here from our browser, so we can keep track of whatever event is running in our application at that given time. And here's our PRC scope. We have favorite color set to green, just like we did with our handler code. And there's also this cbox incoming context hash. That's just an internal thing Coldbox uses to build up part of the machinery in your event handlers as they fire in your application. You don't have to worry about this incoming context hash thing here at all. So how do these fit in with this event object that we've got? Well, let's take a look at what's in the event object. Did that not save? I didn't save my file. Here we go. Try that again. All right. So RC scope, just a couple pieces of data. PRC scope, same thing. Event object is this component, Coldbox System Web Context Request Context. And you can see inside there, we have a bunch of different helper methods that do various things on our application. We're not going to get into all of these in this video. I'll point out a few highlighted ones, if you will, later on. Some of these you'll use in your code more often than others. Notice how it's just a great big helper component with lots of stuff that you can do in your application. One thing that's interesting about this event object is this. You've got 2 methods in here that are useful, one of which is called getCollection. I'm going to Output that, and take a look at what's inside event.getCollection. It's an exact copy of the RC scope. Your RC scope actually lives inside that event object. So you can get to it by one of two ways. I can say RC dot and get to different items, or I can say event.getCollection dot, and then if I said person out here and ran that, you would see we can actually get to that person variable by using that longer style syntax, event.getCollection.person. The RC scope and the PRC scope both live in your event object. You can get to them with this longer style syntax, or you can use the nice shorthand RC dot and then your variable name. They do the exact same thing. A lot of people don't like typing much code, so there's a shorthand version of this, and it's just saying RC. Now how do you get to your PRC scope? Same way, get private collection. Output that, and there's a copy of our private collection. Both of those live inside your event object, along with those various helper methods that we looked at just a minute ago. So really there's no difference in doing it the long way or the short way. It just depends on what style syntax you want to use. Most people generally use the RC and PRC scope because it's shorter, less typing, less verbose, easier to read in your code. And then you'll use the event.function name to get to whatever functions you want to run from the event object as your application does things. If you'd like more information on that event object that's passed into your handlers, you can go to apidocs.ordersolutions.com. That's where the online API references are. Simply type request context into the search, click on request context, and here is all the documentation about that request context component that gets instantiated as our event object in all of our handlers. You can see it starts off with information about the different properties inside there, and then below that we have a list of all the different methods, including the ones we just looked at, get collection. I can click on that and get a little bit of documentation about what the get collection method does, along with which variables get passed into it, what kind of data they are. If this function returns a piece of data, that would be noted in here as well. The documentation for Ortus products is generally pretty well built out. You can see there's something in here for all of the different methods in that object, notes on pretty much all of them. If you have a question about what a method does, you need a little bit more information on it, check out apidocs.ordersolutions.com, look up whatever the object is your question's about, and click on the method name or click on the property name, and there you go. If the API docs are a little bit overwhelming for you, you can come here to coalbox.ordusbooks.com and look up the request context object as well. Here is a list of the more commonly used methods out of that event object. So rather than looking at documentation for the 400 or 500 or however many different methods are in there, you can see the names and descriptions of the things you'll most commonly use in your applications as you build them. Like build link, for example, is how you create a link to a different section or event handler in your application. Get collection we already talked about. There's also things in here for getting specific values out of your application, checking if you have search engine safe URLs turned on or not, checking if you're dealing with an AJAX request, adding or removing values from the collection, setting values, looking for or rather using certain layouts, checking to see if values exist, and then rendering data in various output formats as well, rather than maybe outputting a view as HTML. If you want to output JSON or XML, you can do that with this render data method. This is a really handy reference page for the stuff you'll generally be using most of the time in your application. And then if you really need to get into something else that the event object does, check out the API docs and you can look at those other things in there. Here's a small code sample of how you might be using that event object in your code. Event.getCollection we saw earlier. Event.is is proxy request to see if you're getting a proxy request from your MVC app. And then you can say event.setValue to set a new message variable to this value. Param value, same kind of idea here. Set views to different values if you want to change what view you're using. Setting what layout you're going to use. Notice how these are all just event dot and then some method name. And those methods are all described up here in this most commonly used methods section of the Coalbox Ortus Books documentation.